Governments claim they're working for our financial freedom. We hear words like stability, growth, and opportunity. But if you look closely at history, you see a much darker picture. Because governments always do the same thing. They keep ordinary people broke and consolidate wealth and power in their own hands. The interesting thing is that these methods are not new. They have been playing the same game for a long time. Only the name and the packaging change. But the result is always the same, transferring wealth upward and keeping the majority dependent. We can start with the simplest of all, inflation. If a government wants to spend much more money than it collects through taxes, it has two options. It can openly raise taxes, which the public will not welcome and is politically risky, or it can secretly devalue the currency. That is, the purchasing power of the money in your pocket decreases, but no one tells you that you've paid a tax. Ancient Rome was a professional at this. In the 3rd century AD, emperors, faced with rising military debts, began to reduce the silver content of the coin called the denarius. A coin that was once almost purely silver ended up being just copper, merely washed with silver on top. The government acted as if nothing was happening, but people still felt the difference. Inflation soared, savings vanished, and wages couldn't keep up. This was a silent tax, a tactic that has remained unchanged until today. The only difference is that now we have central banks instead of imperial mints. In the Middle Ages, this game changed a little, but the logic progressed the same way. When kings started to need money, they introduced something called a forced loan. Regardless of whether it was England, France, or Spain, they all demanded loans from wealthy merchants and guilds. Of course, this was not voluntary. If you said no, a fine, confiscation, or worse awaited you. They sometimes promised repayment with interest, but they were often late, repaid with devalued currency, or never paid at all. The government funded its wars and kept its palaces standing. The merchants, on the other hand, lost their money. The game always continued the same way, disguising coercion with the pretense of patriotism or duty. When we arrived at the 17th century, not just the method, but the entire system was turned into a trick. When the Bank of England was founded in 1694, it was not a charity project. The government desperately needed more money to fight a war with France. Wealthy investors loaned money to the state and in return received interest. This interest, of course, came from the taxes paid by ordinary people. So the wealthy earned safely while the burden continued to fall on the public's shoulders. This system was a wealth transfer operating under the name of national finance, and it still is. When we arrived at the modern world, the tricks had only changed form. Consider budget deficits. Governments issue bonds, run into debt. They frame it as investment, infrastructure, social support. But almost all of that money goes to defense companies, subsidies, and bailouts. When repayment time comes, instead of cutting spending, they drastically increase taxes or inflate the currency. But the burden still remains on the public. So the debt always looks like it's for the people, but in reality the public pays the bill and the bondholders always win. Then there are the bailouts. Remember the 2008 crisis. Banks took enormous risks and the system collapsed. Who do you think paid the price? We did. The taxpayers. And who profited? The same banks, emerging much stronger. In short, the gains were privatized and the losses were socialized to the public. They called this saving the system. In fact, pension systems are a similar game. People pay into the state for years thinking this money will return to me when I retire. But most governments, of course, spend that money immediately. Only IOUS remain in its place. Essentially, future generations will pay the current retirement debt. This too is a type of Ponzi scheme described in different language. If the population ages, the system becomes unsustainable. So, reform comes. Retirement ages are raised, payments are reduced, and inflation continues to erode wages. At every stage, the same thing happens. This game is played through perception. They tell the public that inflation is always growth, debt is for investment, bailout is stability, and cuts are reform. But in reality, this is always a wealth transfer upwards. This has worked throughout history because people generally never delve deeply into finance, economics, or the past. The tricks played in recent years have only become much more complex. After 2008, we started hearing a term called quantitative easing. Central banks printed trillions of dollars and injected them into the market. They said, "We are stabilizing the system." And indeed, they saved the system. But for whom? Of course, for the wealthy investors, big funds, and real estate owners, because the value of their assets multiplied even more. For the average person, the result continued to be higher prices and a harder life. Another silent game is stealth taxation. Instead of directly increasing taxes, governments collected money from the public through sales taxes, fuel duties, or most significantly, inflation. Even if your salary continues to increase nominally, if prices rise faster, you are actually getting poorer. Governments love inflation because it reduces the real value of their debt. But the citizens' purchasing power decreases significantly. This is not a bug of the system. It is the system itself. Now there is the situation we call regulatory capture. That is, large corporations influencing the institutions that are supposed to regulate them. Throughout history, railways, oil companies, and now tech and finance giants have all done the same thing. They had the rules written in their favor. The public thought they were being protected. But in reality, competition was suppressed, and the winners remained the same. War finance is another example of this. In World War I and World War II, governments issued war bonds. The public bought these as a display of patriotism, but the bonds were actually risk-free investments for the wealthy. In the modern age, there is a similar situation, of course. The cost of wars like Iraq and Afghanistan will be paid by future generations through taxes. And finally, the most effective weapon governments use is actually complexity. Tax codes are thousands of pages long, and the financial system is so complicated that even experts struggle with it. This confusion is actually camouflage, because you can never question what you don't understand. In Rome, devalued coins were the physical indicator of the trick. Today, it is figures hidden behind spreadsheets and jargon. Do you know why this matters? Because these tricks are still here and continue to operate even faster. Inflation is consuming our savings, debts are multiplying, and bailouts are still presented as the only solution. Central banks manipulate the money supply, and governments pass the bill to us indirectly. What's the result? Those at the very top get much stronger, while everyone else works harder but possesses less real wealth. What history teaches us is this: these tricks will never completely disappear. They will just change form. Citizens suffered in Rome. Merchants lost out in the Middle Ages. Today we are paying. The era changes, but the mechanism remains the same. And the bitter truth of the matter is this: most people are still not even aware that they are in the middle of these games. They perceive inflation as natural, taxes as inevitable, and bailouts as acts of mercy. Those who don't know history repeat the same mistake. Perhaps that's why governments love a public uneducated in finance, because financial literacy is actually a form of resistance. So what should be done? 1. You must look beyond the headlines, at the behind the scenes. If the government says stimulus, you must ask who wins first. 2. Try to acquire real assets that hold their value. 3. Never assume the system is working for you. It will protect itself, never you. History may not repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you. The game that devalued the Romans' money is the same one that is eroding the value in your bank account today. The only difference is whether you recognize it in time. If this information gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History holds many answers, and I'm showing you where to find them.